So, imagine fixing a leaky pipe inside your bathroom wall. You open it up, you find a patch of this slimy, dark mold.
Right, the classic nightmare.
Yeah, exactly. But you fix the leak, you dry the area out with a fan, and you think, okay, I've solved the problem. Well, what if I told you that drying it out is actually what causes that mold to release a toxic, invisible cloud directly into your lungs?
It's really the ultimate counterintuitive hazard. I mean, we are so conditioned to think that moisture is the enemy.
Which it is.
Right, it is. But the mechanical process of that moisture drying up, that is exactly what triggers the organism to aerosolize and go into full survival mode.
Wow. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are unpacking the hidden, really high-stakes world of property hazards today, specifically focusing on that silent invader inside our walls. Mold.
And, the broader ecosystem of property compliance around it.
Exactly, because there is a massive legal and financial war happening here. We have a fascinating stack of sources for you today. We're synthesizing cutting-edge NIH epidemiologic reviews, Texas property code legal disputes, commercial insurance reports from Chubb, and even the new 2026 federal legislation known as the Mold Act.
Yeah. Our goal today is to connect the biological realities, like what indoor dampness physically does to the human body, to the shifting regulations we're seeing at the local and federal level.
Right. And then tracing those massive financial ripple effects hitting the commercial real estate and insurance markets.
Because why should you care, right? Well, whether you are renting your very first apartment or managing a high-rise office building or just trying to keep your own home safe and properly insured.
It matters.
Exactly. The intersection of building health, property law, and insurance costs is absolutely going to impact your wallet and, honestly, your physical well-being.
Absolutely. So before we get into the legal battles and the skyrocketing insurance premiums, I think we really need to understand the biological reality. Like, what is this organism actually doing inside the human body?
Well, the organism itself is incredibly simple. I mean, looking at the California Department of Public Health data and those NIH reviews we synthesized, mold relies on just two things to thrive. It needs moisture, and it needs a food source.
Right. And in modern construction, that food source is just built right into the architecture.
Oh, completely. It is the paper backing on your drywall. It's the organic dust sitting in your air ducts or, just the wood framing inside the walls.
So since we can't exactly build houses without wood or drywall, the only variable anyone can actually control is the moisture.
Bingo. And when a building owner fails to control that moisture, the health impacts are really severe. The NIH epidemiologic review clearly shows that indoor dampness and mold are consistently linked to asthma development.
Yeah, leaving people gasping for air. The sources talk about chronic dyspnea, shortness of breath, heavy wheezing, and even skin conditions like eczema.
Right, so we aren't just talking about a musty smell in a basement. It is an active trigger for chronic respiratory disease. In fact, one of the reviews highlighted this fascinating intervention study by Kirksmar and colleagues.
Oh yeah, the one with the asthmatic kids.
Yes, exactly. They focused on highly symptomatic asthmatic children living in damp, moldy homes. But instead of just, prescribing more inhalers or steroids, the researchers physically intervened in the environment.
They treated the building instead of just treating the patient, which is such a wild concept.
It is. They went into the homes and conducted comprehensive removal of the dampness sources and the visible mold, and the results were staggering.
I remember reading this. It was a 90% drop, right?
Yeah. By comprehensively removing the environmental trigger, they saw a massive 90% reduction in acute care visits for those asthmatic children at the 6 to 12-month mark.
90%. That is incredible.
It really underscores that you just cannot medicate your way out of a toxic environment.
Right. Well, I want to zoom in on the villain that always makes the evening news. Black mold or Stachybotrys chartarum.
Ah, yes. The infamous one.
The mechanics of how this specific organism harms you are fascinating, going back to what we mentioned at the very start of the deep dive.
Right, so when a homeowner or an inspector finds Stachybotrys, it is usually near a persistent, slow leak. And the mold itself looks wet and slimy.
Sounds awful.
It is, but here's the crazy part. Because it is saturated with water, the spores are trapped in that slime, so your exposure risk in that specific moment is actually surprisingly low.
Wait, really? So when it's actively wet and gross, it's less dangerous to breathe around?
Exactly. The danger emerges when the environment changes. Say the plumber comes in, fixes the leak, but the contractor doesn't tear out the contaminated drywall.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. As that Stachybotrys dries up, it aerosolizes. It goes into survival mode and releases its spores into the air.
And those spores aren't just like a minor irritant. The sources say they're carrying mycotoxins.
Right. Mycotoxins are toxic chemical byproducts produced by fungi. Unlike a standard allergen like pollen, which just triggers an immune overreaction, mycotoxins can directly damage cells.
They interfere with cellular processes when inhaled.
Yep. They are essentially a biological defense mechanism for the mold, and they just wreak havoc on the human respiratory system.
Okay, but hold on. The NIH study also brings up this concept called the hygiene hypothesis.
Oh, right, yeah.
It's the idea that early life exposure to microbes and dirt actually trains our immune systems, and protects us against allergies.
Sure, the farm dirt theory.
Exactly. So if growing up in a slightly dirty environment is supposed to make a kid's immune system stronger, why is indoor mold universally bad? Doesn't the hygiene hypothesis mean we should, I don't know, embrace a little dampness to toughen up?
Well, the hygiene hypothesis is real, but the mechanics of the exposure are completely different. The microbial exposure that offers protective effects, like a child playing in the dirt on a working farm, involves complex compounds like endotoxins.
Endotoxin.
Yeah, endotoxins are fragments of bacteria's cell walls, so exposing a developing immune system to diverse outdoor bacteria can actually help calibrate it.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the epidemiologic data shows that damp, moldy indoor buildings only increase respiratory disease. There's no benefit there.
So farm dirt provides complex immune training, while fungal mycotoxins from a leaky pipe just, poison the respiratory tract.
Exactly. There is zero protective benefit to inhaling concentrated fungal spores in an enclosed, poorly ventilated space. It is a fundamentally different biological exposure.
Wow. Well, if the biology is that destructive, it really makes sense why cities and governments are no longer treating property maintenance as a private issue. A fix-it-when-you-get-around-to-it homeowner thing.
Oh, absolutely. The public health burden is just way too high.
Right. Which brings us to this aggressive regulatory crackdown we're seeing, starting right at the municipal level.
You can really see the intensity of this crackdown in local ordinances. I mean, looking at the Chapter 10 building codes for Houston and Galveston, they essentially weaponize code enforcement.
To stop environmental decay long before it reaches the interior of a home.
Exactly.
And the Houston codes are incredibly strict.
Yeah.
I mean, they cite property owners for weeds over 9 inches tall.
Yeah.
Or brush over 7 feet.
Yeah, they do not mess around.
No. And if you have stagnant water on your property, you will be fined. Because the city knows that stagnant water is a breeding ground for mosquitoes carrying vector-borne diseases. They even penalize accumulating materials that provide rat harborage.
And those fines are no joke. They range from $50 all the way up to $2,000. But the city doesn't just issue a ticket and walk away.
Right, there's that emergency clause.
Yes. If those weeds hit 48 inches, Houston has the authority to initiate emergency corrective action.
Which means what exactly?
It means they can enter the property, clear the hazard without providing standard notice, and then place a lien on the property to recover their costs.
Wow. So they literally just seize control of the maintenance.
Yeah. The municipality views urban decay as a fast-spreading public health crisis, and they act accordingly.
So zooming in on mold specifically, the state of Texas uses the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, the TDLR, to enforce this rigid threshold.
The 25-square-foot rule.
Exactly. If mold contamination in a building exceeds 25 contiguous square feet, the state gets involved. It triggers a mandatory official notification, a $25 fee, and requires strict documented remediation protocols.
Right, so a landlord cannot just hand a maintenance worker a bottle of bleach and a sponge. They have to follow the law.
Right. But while local municipalities and state agencies are tightening the net, there has historically been this massive, dangerous blind spot in the United States.
Which brings us to the federal level.
Yes. In January 2026, lawmakers introduced the MOLD Act, the Military Occupancy Living Defense Act.
This legislation targets the estimated 700,000 service members and their families who are living in privatized military housing. It mandates independent inspections and requires third-party certifications.
Okay, but wait. If local city codes are already hyper-strict, finding people for a 10-inch weed or a tire in the yard like some municipal game of whack-a-mole, why did Congress need to step in and draft a massive piece of federal legislation just for mold?
Well, it's because privatized military housing exists in this really unique jurisdictional loophole. These housing developments are usually located on or affiliated with federal military installations.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so local municipal code enforcers literally cannot pass the security gates. They do not have jurisdiction on federal land.
Wow, so the local laws couldn't reach them at all.
Exactly. For years, this left hundreds of thousands of military families completely vulnerable. Private contractors managing the housing could just ignore severe maintenance issues.
Leading to chronic mold exposure, severe neurological symptoms, and even developmental delays in military children. That's awful. So the contractors basically operated with impunity.
Right. But the Mold Act closes that jurisdictional gap. And it doesn't just ask for better inspections, it requires certifications tied directly to the ICRC S520 standard.
Which is a lot of acronyms.
It is, yeah. But it isn't just a piece of paper. The S520 standard is a rigorous, peer-reviewed engineering protocol that outlines the actual physics of safely removing mold.
So it dictates how to set up containment barriers and manage airflow.
Exactly, so that removing mold from one military apartment doesn't accidentally pump toxic spores into the neighboring units.
Okay, so if cities are aggressively enforcing yard codes and state agencies are tracking 25-square-foot mold patches, and the federal government is closing the military housing loophole, it begs the question, what actual power does all this regulation give the everyday renter? Like the tenant who is stuck breathing in a damp bedroom tonight.
It gives them significant legal leverage. I mean, the regulatory shift has completely changed the landscape of tenant-landlord disputes.
The sources provided this really harrowing real-world scenario from a Justia Ask a Lawyer Q&A that perfectly illustrates this dynamic.
Right, the Garland case.
Yeah, a tenant in Garland, Texas, had been dealing with a leaking window and visible mold spreading across the bedroom and bathroom for months. And it wasn't just a cosmetic issue.
No, the respiratory impact was so severe that the tenant actually had to postpone a scheduled surgery.
Which is insane.
Yeah.
And the property management company did a terrible job trying to patch the drywall. The window continued to leak every time it rained, and they absolutely refused to release the tenant from the lease.
The tenant ultimately had to pay out of pocket to stay in a hotel just to breathe safely.
Right? So what happens there?
Well, under Texas real estate law, that tenant has a formidable case. The foundation of this leverage is called the warranty of habitability.
Meaning the landlord has to keep the place livable.
Yes. A landlord is legally obligated to make a diligent effort to repair any condition that materially affects the physical health or safety of an ordinary tenant.
And the courts don't let landlords drag their feet. Right. From what I read, 7 days is typically considered a reasonable timeline for a landlord to take meaningful action once they are notified.
Exactly, 7 days. But the tenant has to follow a very specific set of rules to activate these protections.
Right. The procedural steps are critical.
First, the tenant must provide written notice of the hazard. Doing this with tracking or a signature requirement is vital because you need a paper trail proving exactly when that 7-day clock started ticking.
That makes sense. And second, the tenant cannot be delinquent on rent.
Yes, this is a big one. If
Yeah.
a tenant gets angry about the mold and decides to, withhold their rent check and protest, they instantly lose their legal leverage under the statute.
Wow. Okay. And third, the damage cannot be the result of the tenant's own negligence. Like they didn't flood the bathroom themselves.
Right. And if the tenant checks all those boxes and the landlord still refuses to fix the hazardous environment, the penalties under Texas Property Code Section 92.056 are severe.
The liability exposure for the landlord is massive. The tenant can unilaterally break the lease without penalty. They can repair the issue themselves and deduct the cost from their next rent payment.
Or they can even take the landlord to court to sue for their hotel bills, medical expenses, moving costs, and pain and suffering.
But wait, if I am signing a 40-page lease for an apartment complex filled with dense legal jargon, isn't the property management company just going to bury a waiver on page 37?
Oh, you mean like an as-is clause?
Yeah. Something that says the tenant accepts the property as is and assumes all financial and legal responsibility for any mold discovered. Can't they just contract their way out of this?
Property managers try that all the time, but the Texas Property Code explicitly forbids it.
Really?
Yes. You cannot contract your way out of providing a safe, habitable living space. Statutory duties regarding a tenant's health and safety cannot be waived.
So the waiver is basically useless.
Completely useless. There are incredibly narrow, rare exceptions, such as a single-family home where both parties agree at the very start of the lease that the tenant will handle specific repairs.
But that's super rare.
Very rare. And crucially, that is only valid if no hazard currently exists when the document is signed. A corporate landlord cannot bury a general waiver in an apartment lease to shield themselves from the liability of a leaking, moldy window.
Man, that shifts the power dynamic significantly. A renter is not trapped just because they signed a piece of paper. But taking this from a single apartment bedroom to a sprawling 40-story commercial office building introduces an entirely different scale of chaos.
Oh, completely.
We are talking about a perfect storm of liability, massive operational downtime, and exploding insurance costs.
Right. The commercial scale fundamentally changes the physics of remediation. According to 247 restoration specialists in Houston, dealing with mold in a commercial high-rise requires massive, highly engineered containment strategies.
Right, like those commercial negative air pressure systems. It's essentially like putting a giant filtered vacuum over an entire floor of an office building.
Yeah, it physically alters the air pressure inside the containment zone.
This ensures that if a worker opens a plastic flap to walk into the contaminated area, clean air from the hallway only rushes in.
Exactly. It physically prevents a single microscopic spore from escaping out into the clean offices where hundreds of people are still working.
Which is wild to think about. But the most dangerous vulnerability in commercial remediation is the HVAC system, right?
Oh, without a doubt. Commercial air conditioning is heavily interconnected. If a contaminated HVAC system is turned on during the remediation process, it will pull spore-filled air from the contaminated suite into the return duct and spray those toxic spores across 3 different floors in a matter of minutes.
Which turns a localized leak into a multi-million-dollar disaster. And the timelines really reflect that complexity. Cleaning a single isolated office suite might take 3 to 5 days. But if the HVAC system across multiple floors is compromised,
That building is looking at 2 to 4 weeks of operational downtime.
2 to 4 weeks.
Yeah. And for a commercial landlord, that downtime is catastrophic.
Yeah.
They face immediate OSHA complaints from the workers in the building. Their commercial tenants can legally terminate their leases using the same property code protections we just discussed.
So the liability exposure just balloons by the hour.
Exactly.
But the financial hit to the building owner doesn't end when the remediation crew packs up. The Chubb insurance report we analyzed breaks down how converging economic forces have made replacing or repairing a damaged commercial building vastly more expensive today than it was even a few years ago.
The data in the report is alarming. U.S. Census data showed that construction costs spiked 17.5% year over year from 2020 to 2021.
Which is insane. That was the highest annual increase in half a century. And at the peak of the supply chain crisis, lumber prices jumped 171%.
Right.
But why does a spike in lumber prices matter so much to a commercial property insurance policy?
Well, because property insurance is fundamentally based on the concept of like-kind and quality replacement cost, not the real estate market value of the land.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice?
Let's say a business owner insured their commercial property in 2019 with a policy limit of $5 million. Fast forward to 2026, a massive storm hits, the roof fails, and water destroys 3 floors.
Ouch.
The owner files a claim, but because of climate-strained supply chains, localized labor shortages, and inflation, local contractors are quoting $8 million to rebuild those 3 floors with the same materials.
But the insurance policy limit is still stuck at $5 million.
Exactly. The insurance company will only pay up to the limit of the policy. The building owner is suddenly out of pocket for the remaining $3 million just to get their building back to the condition it was in before the storm.
Wow.
The Chubb report warns that a dangerous percentage of businesses are currently underinsured because they haven't updated their property limits to reflect the current hyperinflated cost of construction materials.
Right. And they also desperately need business interruption coverage because the lost rent during those 4 weeks of HVAC remediation will bankrupt them before the repair bill even arrives.
Oh, absolutely.
But let me ask you about liability in these commercial spaces. If I own a commercial building and my tenants say a tech startup on the 4th floor leaves a window open over the weekend during a massive rainstorm, causing a massive mold bloom, am I the one stuck paying these skyrocketing repair and insurance costs?
Well, that scenario is exactly why restoration companies deploy rigorous forensic investigation. Liability ultimately comes down to the specific language in the commercial lease and the undeniable root cause of the moisture.
So they investigate how the water got in.
Yes. If the forensic moisture readings and structural inspections prove the mold stems from a landlord-controlled system like a failing roof membrane or a leaking primary HVAC chiller pipe, The landlord absorbs the liability.
Okay, but what if the data points to the tenant, like the open window?
If the forensic evidence proves the moisture was introduced by tenant activity, leaving a window open during a storm, or maybe failing to report a highly visible plumbing leak for a month, or using improper ventilation for their specific business operations, then the tenant is held liable for the remediation and the damages.
That makes sense.
Insurance adjusters rely entirely on precise pre- and post-moisture readings to determine fault and resolve these high-stakes disputes. It is all about scientifically proving exactly how the water entered the space.
So pulling all of these complex threads together, a very clear narrative emerges from our sources today. The undeniable biological reality of indoor dampness, specifically the way mycotoxins physically attack the human respiratory system, has triggered a massive societal shift.
Yes, local municipalities are heavily penalizing urban decay. The federal government is stepping in to protect military families with rigorous engineering standards.
And tenants are no longer at the mercy of neglectful property managers. They are empowered by state property codes to legally demand habitable spaces.
Right. And on the macro level, the sheer mechanical complexity of commercial remediation, combined with hyper-inflated construction costs, has completely reshaped the risk landscape for real estate and insurance.
Exactly. So being well-informed about the hidden hazards in your environment is not just about keeping a building looking nice or passing a routine inspection.
Not at all.
It is fundamentally about protecting your respiratory health, understanding the legal leverage you hold when someone fails to protect you, and securing your financial investments against the catastrophic cost of modern repairs.
Because a deep understanding of your environment and your legal rights is, honestly, the most effective containment barrier you have.
Very well said. I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to explore on your own. We know the climate is shifting, right? Bringing more severe storms and increasing the overall dampness of the built environment. As we look to the future, what if the next frontier of architecture isn't just about building stronger, thicker walls?
That's an interesting thought.
What if the solution lies in creating living building materials, engineered biomaterials that act as an active immune system, capable of detecting moisture and neutralizing mold spores before they ever have the chance to take hold in our homes?
A building that diagnoses and heals its own environmental hazards. That would fundamentally change the way we live.
It would mean the end of the silent invader. Just something to think about the next time you spot a shadow of water damage on the ceiling. Until next time, stay curious.